3 words. That's all it took. And every man standing in that yard that morning would spend the rest of his life reckoning with what followed. I was there, friend, leaning against a cottonwood not 40 yards from the Whitmore Spring, and I watched every bit of it unfold. Watched those riders spread out around a young woman who hadn't wronged a single soul. Watched the sheriff tip his hat like he was attending a picnic instead of a shakedown. Watched the preacher clasp his hands and find something very interesting to study in the dirt at his feet. And I watched the man in the sun-bleached poncho, lean, somewhere around 30, trail dust worked into every crease of his clothes, riding a red roan mare who was long overdue for water. He came in slow, took one look at what was happening, and said it again. Leave her alone. They left. That was the worst decision they ever made. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and the spring on her land, sitting cool and constant in Haskell County, New Mexico Territory, in the scorching August of 1883, was the only reliable water source for 50 miles in any direction. Her father, old Thomas Whitmore, had understood that spring the way a chess player understands a queen. It was the peace that made everything else matter. His cattle drank when others were hauling from dry creek beds. His neighbors always seemed to owe him something. He'd built his whole operation around that cold, patient fact. He died in June without any warning. Hart gave out somewhere between breakfast and noon, and left the ranch to his daughter and whatever stubbornness she'd inherited from him. She had plenty. What Clara didn't know yet, couldn't have known, was that the quiet, dusty stranger who'd just ridden in from the south carried a history that would have changed the temperature of that whole encounter if any of those men had recognized him. They were about to find out the hard way. If this is your first time here, friend, go ahead and hit subscribe and tap that bell so you never miss one of these stories. And before we ride on, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. What time is it where you are? I always want to know who's out there riding along. Now let's go back. Back to that August morning. Back to the spring. Thomas Whitmore had built the Rocking W out of nothing but labor and refusal to quit. 30 years working Haskell County ground, hauling water and mending wire, losing cattle to hard winters and bad luck, and somewhere in the middle of it all finding that spring. A cold, dependable seep that opened into a rock basin the size of a wagon bed and had never gone dry. Not through the worst droughts the territory could produce. He'd cleared it out, lined it with flat stone, built a catch trough. To him it wasn't just water. It was the reason the whole operation held together. He had one child, Clara. She'd grown up riding beside him, reading his ledgers by lantern light, learning every acre of that land by instinct and repetition. She was 23 when he died. Dark-haired, gray-eyed like her father, with a temper she kept on a tight rein most of the time. She wasn't a fragile person, but she was alone on a ranch that suddenly had a great many men paying it very close attention. The source of that attention had a name: Garrett Pruitt. Pruitt ran the Consolidated Grazing Company out of a brick office in Las Cruces. What he wanted in this part of the territory wasn't complicated. He wanted water. Not because he was thirsty. The Southern Pacific Railroad was coming through Haskell County inside of 2 years, and every rancher within 20 miles understood that whoever held the reliable water along that right-of-way would control the beef. Supply for every construction crew from here to El Paso. Cattle contracts, worth more money than most men accumulated in a lifetime. Pruitt had been buying up water rights for months, quietly, methodically. 3 ranches sold without much fuss. 2 more collapsed when their credit dried up at the only bank in Cutter Creek, mysteriously, suddenly, completely. One old rancher held out and found his winter hay burned to the ground in October. He was on a stage to Albuquerque by November. Pruitt never touched any of it personally. That was the elegance of having the right men in the right positions. Sheriff Dale Huck held the badge in Haskell County, and that badge served Pruitt's interests as reliably as a good hound serves a hunter. Huck wasn't stupid. He understood that a territorial appointment was only as solid as the recommendation that secured it, and that recommendation had come from Garrett Pruitt. So when Pruitt's men needed the law to occupy itself elsewhere, Huck occupied himself elsewhere. He'd constructed enough private justifications that he'd mostly stopped feeling it. The preacher was a gentler variety of corruption. Father Donald Kemp ran the only church in Cutter Creek, and Pruitt had funded the new roof and the stained glass window of St. Francis that Kemp spoke of with such visible pride. Kemp had never asked where the money originated. He told himself that good work could be done with money that came from complicated sources. He told himself this often enough that it had become something resembling conviction. Pruitt's enforcer was a hired gun named Willis Rand, out of Abilene, with a reputation that arrived before he did like smoke before a fire. 3 confirmed kills, 2 of them ugly even by frontier standards. 28 years old, quiet in the way that certain men go quiet, not from peace but from practice. He was very fast with a pistol, and he worked for men like Pruitt because the work suited his disposition. When Thomas Whitmore died and Clara refused to sell, Pruitt gave her 60 days. Then he sent Rand and 4 riders to the Rocking W for what he called a persuasion visit. It was a Tuesday morning. The kind of August morning that presses down on you, sky gone white with heat, dust suspended in the air even when nothing moved through it. Clara had been at the spring since first light, filling the catch trough, when she spotted them coming across the flat from half a mile out. She put her back to the stone basin and waited, 5 of them. Rand in front, 2 consolidated riders flanking. Behind them, keeping a careful distance, Sheriff Huck on a gray gelding. Father Kemp on a mule. The preacher hadn't wanted to come, but Pruitt had asked personally, and Kemp had learned by now that Pruitt's personal requests weren't really a question. They pulled up 10 yards from the spring, and Rand looked at Clara the way a man looks at an obstacle he's already decided to remove. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Mr. Pruitt's been patient. He's still willing to pay fair value. But this conversation is happening today, one way or the other." Clara's father's Winchester was leaning against the stone trough 6 feet behind her. She'd positioned it there when she first saw them coming. Close enough. Not in her hands. She kept her hands where they could be seen, and her voice where it needed to be. "The answer hasn't changed," she said. "Not in 2 months, not in 4. This land is not for sale." Rand glanced at the riders beside him. A thick-necked man named Doyle nudged his horse forward and took hold of Clara's arm above the wrist. Not violently, just a grip meant to make a point about who was running things in this yard today, and then hoofbeats from the south trail, unhurried, a red Roan mare. A man in a faded poncho the color of old sage, trail dust settled into everything from his boot heels to his hat brim, a canteen that rattled empty on his saddle. Lean and young, maybe 31 or 32, with dark eyes that moved across the whole scene without visible alarm, just a slight tightening at the jaw. He rode to the edge of the group and stopped. He looked at Doyle's grip on Clara's wrist. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at the preacher. Then he settled his gaze on Rand. "Leave her alone." Rand turned toward the new arrival with the mild expression of a man who's just noticed a dog wandering into his camp. Faint irritation. "Nothing more, right on, friend. Private business here." The man in the poncho didn't move. His mare shifted a foot, stretched her nose toward the spring trough. He let her go those few steps and she drank, and he sat on her back and watched Doyle's hand still locked on Clara's wrist. "Let her go," he said. "Last time I say it with any courtesy." Something shifted in Rand's expression then. Not quite fear, but not yet. More like the look of a man who's receiving information that doesn't match what he expected and is quietly updating his calculations. The drifter wasn't doing what most men did. He wasn't backing down and he wasn't blustering. He just sat there while the mare drank and waited, as though he'd already seen clearly how this ended and had no particular urgency about getting there. "You've got nerve for a man on a thirsty horse," Rand said. "Horse is getting water," the man replied. "Yours are the ones with something to worry about." Rand's right hand started its move toward his belt. What happened next? "Friend, nobody who witnessed it could properly reconstruct it afterward, and I was right there." One moment the man in the poncho was sitting still with both hands resting quiet on the saddle horn. The next, a single shot cracked open the August air, and Willis Rand's gun hand erupted in a spray of blood, and he was bent double over his saddle, screaming, the revolver he'd barely cleared spinning away into the dust. Doyle released Clara's wrist like he'd grabbed hold of something burning. The 2 flanking riders went so motionless they might have been statues. Nobody reached for anything. Nobody produced a single sound except Rand, who was cursing in broken gasps, pressing his right hand against his chest. The man in the poncho had not shifted from his seat. A thin thread of smoke curled from the old Colt in his hand, and then he returned it to his holster in one clean motion, the way you'd slide a letter back into an envelope. He's still alive, he said, to no one in particular. That was deliberate. He looked at the sheriff. Huck had turned the color of old ash. You want to do your job today? The man said quietly. Or keep doing his. He tilted his head in the direction Pruitt's riders had come from. Huck said nothing. The man looked at the preacher. Kemp had his eyes fixed on his mule's reins, hands clenched white. Preacher, the man said, you're going to have considerable trouble sleeping after this. Then he turned to the 4 remaining riders and delivered his final observation the way a man states an observable fact about weather. Now, get off this land. They got off the land. Rand, hunched and hissing, let one of the riders lead his horse by the reins. They went south toward Cutter Creek, and the sound of their horses faded out, and the cottonwoods along the spring stopped trembling, and Clara Whitmore stood beside the stone basin with her father's Winchester now in her hands. Watching the last of them disappear over the rise, she looked at the man in the poncho. That was Willis Rand, she said, from Abilene. I know who he is. You shot his gun hand. I did. She studied him for a moment. You want to tell me who you are? He was quiet. Then, my name is Cal Devereaux. I needed water for my horse. He swung down from the saddle and led the roan back to the trough and let her finish drinking. Now, friend, before we ride any further tonight, if this story is worth your time, go ahead and tap that subscribe button and hit the bell. You won't miss a single one. And leave a comment. Tell me where you are right now and what hour it is. Are you somewhere out west driving a long road? Settled into bed somewhere back east trying to let the day go? Tell me. We've had listeners from places that would genuinely surprise you. Pour yourself something warm. Let's find out who Cal Devereaux really was. The name Cal Devereaux meant nothing to Clara Whitmore. It meant quite a lot to certain men across 4 territories and the state of Texas. 10 years before, at 21, Devereaux had taken a deputy's position in Laredo under a federal marshal named Clarence Poe. For 6 years, he tracked fugitives across country that would kill a careless man, without trying, brought in rustlers and killers and worse, and built a reputation the way dangerous reputations build, quietly, through the testimony of men who had seen what he was capable of and made sure they were somewhere else the next time his name came up. He was fast. That was the simple word for it. The fastest draw most men who saw it once ever encountered, and he possessed the particular patience that distinguishes good lawmen, the kind that lets you wait the whole day for the single moment when waiting becomes the wrong choice. Then there had been a town called Canyon Rojo, a mining camp in the Himes Mountains. A man named Latimer who'd compromised a payroll strongbox through someone Devereaux had trusted. 9 miners had died in what followed. Devereaux had gone after Latimer alone, against Marshal Poe's direct orders, had ridden him down over 3 days and brought him back draped across his saddle, but the miners were still dead. Their families were still without husbands and fathers. Devereaux had carried that the way you carry something sewn into the lining of your coat, always present, never getting any lighter. Since Canyon Rojo, he'd drifted a wide circuit, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, and down through the territory, taking on work where it needed doing and moving on before anyone could attach a permanent name to his presence. He wasn't running, but he was looking for something. Though if you'd asked him to name it, he'd have struggled to find the right words. He'd heard about the Whitmore Spring from a stage driver 2 weeks south, who'd mentioned the Consolidated Company, and a young woman who'd refused every pressure they'd applied. Something in that story had pulled at him the way certain things do, without clear logic, until he turned the roan south and followed it. He didn't lay all of this out for Clara at once. He told her pieces of it that evening, sitting on the porch steps while the light left the sky in stages, copper first, then gray. She sat in her father's chair with the Winchester across her knees and listened without interruption, which he found he appreciated considerably. You shot Willis Rand's hand, she said again when he finished. Still working through it. I've never killed a man who didn't make it completely unavoidable, he said. Rand hadn't reached that point. He might decide tomorrow to be a different kind of man. Probably won't, but that wasn't my decision to make. They'll come back, Clara said. With more men. Yes, Devereaux agreed. Pruitt has money. Men like Rand are replaceable to him. He'll send 6 next time, or 10, and he won't come himself because men like him never do. Clara was quiet, watching the last color drain from the western horizon. "You don't have to stay," she said. "No," Devereaux agreed. "I don't." He stayed. He took the small tack room off the barn, a cot, a lantern, nothing more, and spent his first night cleaning his pistol and thinking. At pre-dawn, he walked the full perimeter in the gray half-light and identified 3 approach corridors that concerned him: the dry wash to the west, the tree line along the north fence, and a low rise behind the barn that offered a clear rifle shot at the house from 300 yards. He memorized these the way a man memorizes the geography of a place he knows he'll be fighting in. That day he spent with Clara taking inventory: wire, lumber, barn door hinges, house shutters, sight lines from the spring across the yard. She knew this ground better than he ever would, and she showed him things he'd walked right past. A second water source he hadn't noticed. A dry stone root cellar built into the hillside, invisible unless you already knew where to look. The way the cottonwoods along the creek formed a natural barrier that slowed any mounted approach from the east. She was intelligent in the way that counted out here. Not just book-educated, though she'd had some of that from her mother before her mother's passing. She was land-intelligent, the deep, specific understanding that only comes from growing up on a particular piece of ground and letting it teach you everything it knows. Devereaux had known men who'd worked a property for 20 years and still didn't read it the way Clara read the rocking W at 23. In the afternoon, she showed him a ledger, not the ranch ledger, a different one. Kept under the floorboards of her father's office, a room barely larger than a closet, just off the main room. 3 years of entries, methodical and precise. Every conversation where Pruitt's name had surfaced. Every neighbor who'd sold under duress. Every visit from Consolidated's riders, with dates and sums wherever he could pin them down. Thomas Whitmore had not been waiting passively. He'd been accumulating evidence, slowly, carefully without fanfare, because he believed, as men of that generation sometimes believed with an almost religious faith, that the law eventually catches up to the ones who think they're above it. He was building a case, Devereaux said, turning pages carefully at the kitchen table. He always said the law gets there eventually, Clara said. He just didn't live to see it. Devereaux looked up at her. Something moved across his expression. The particular look of a man who's been carrying something heavy and has just glimpsed a place he might be able to set it down. "Where's the nearest federal marshal's office?" "Santa Fe, 3 days' ride." Devereaux looked at the ledger. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his poncho and placed a small leather document wallet on the table beside it. "What is that?" Clara asked. "My credentials," he said. "I'm not just a drifter, Miss Whitmore. I rode for the Federal Marshal's Service for 6 years. I have people in Santa Fe, and I've been watching Garrett Pruitt for the past 4 months. He told her everything then. How he'd been following a separate line of evidence, a railroad commissioner up in Colorado who'd accepted bribes to steer the Southern Pacific Survey through Consolidated friendly territory, and how that thread had eventually led him south to Haskell County. He had his own notes. He had a written statement from a former Consolidated bookkeeper who'd fled to Tucson and documented everything he'd witnessed from inside the operation. He had names, dates, figures. He had the full shape of it. What he hadn't had, until Clara's father's ledger, was the local evidence tying Pruitt's campaign to specific acts of intimidation against specific landowners in this county. Together, the two records were the kind of thing a territorial judge could act on. "He's not simply acquiring water rights," Devereaux said. "He's bribing a federal railroad commission. He's using unlawful coercion against private landowners. He's turned a county sheriff into a personal instrument. That's federal jurisdiction. That's the kind of case that reaches the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe and doesn't come back until people are in chains." Clara sat with that for a long moment. "Why didn't you say any of this morning?" she asked. "Because this morning I didn't know about your father's ledger," Devereaux said. "I knew what I had." "I didn't know what you had," she almost smiled. Brief, not quite reaching her eyes, but there. "So what do we do now?" "We survive the next 48 hours, he said. "Then we get those papers to Santa Fe." The night passed without incident, though neither of them slept with any confidence. Devereaux sat on the barn roof from midnight to dawn with his rifle across his knees, listening to the territory settle and breathe. An owl in the cottonwoods, coyotes off to the north, and once, around 3 a.m, the sound of a horse on the south trail that slowed and stopped and then didn't come any closer. A scout, most likely. He let them look. Let them count windows and calculate. At dawn, he came down, built a small fire, put coffee on. Clara came out of the house with her hair still pinned from the night before and accepted the mug he offered without ceremony, and they drank it together in silence while the sun came up and turned the flats from pale gray to gold. "Tell me what's coming," she said. He told her plainly. Pruitt would have word about Rand before last evening's supper. He'd understand immediately that the man who disarmed his hired gun wasn't a random drifter. Even without a name, the competence alone told him that. He'd move quickly, because men like Pruitt understood that their entire operation rested on the architecture of fear, and fear is fragile. The moment people in Cutter Creek started passing around the story of Willis Rand getting disarmed in a girl's yard, the whole structure Pruitt had spent years constructing would begin to crack. "He'll want it resolved before the story travels any further," Devereaux said, "which means today, or tonight at the latest." "Then we'd better be ready by noon," Clara said. They spent the morning preparing. Devereaux strung a length of wire across the dry wash at roughly chest height for a mounted rider, not to throw anyone, but to slow them and announce them. He stacked split wood against the barn's north wall to interrupt the sightline from the rise. Clara established herself in the root cellar with her father's Winchester, a clear view of the entire yard, and 2 boxes of ammunition from the floor safe that she mentioned only now, which Devereaux chose not to remark on, since she'd told him when it actually mattered, around midday. Father Kemp arrived on his mule, alone, hands in plain sight. He stopped 20 feet from the house and called Clara's name. She came to the porch with the Winchester in her hands, not quite aimed at him. The preacher said he had come to warn her. Pruitt had 6 riders going out that afternoon. Rand's replacement was a man named Caulfield, from what Kemp had overheard, a different sort of professional from Rand. Colder, more methodical, less interested in theater. And Pruitt, Kemp said, was finished with offers. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara said. Kemp was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the reins. He was a small man who had made a series of what he'd told himself were small decisions, and had only recently understood that they had not been small at all. You could see that comprehension sitting on him like something heavy he'd only just picked up. "Because your father was a good man," he said finally. "And I have been telling myself for a long time that what I've been doing is somehow separate from what Pruitt does. And I know that's a lie." Devereaux stepped out of the barn doorway into the morning sun. Kemp looked at him, and something moved across the preacher's face. Recognition, or very nearly it. "I know your name," Kemp said quietly. "I served a church in Laredo 2 years before I came here." "Then you know I'm not exaggerating," Devereaux said. "And there's something I need you to do." He handed Kemp a sealed letter he'd written before first light. 2 pages in a careful hand, addressed to the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. He told Kemp to ride there directly, to present that letter along with Thomas Whitmore's ledger to the duty marshal, and to state that Calvin Devereaux was requesting urgent assistance in Haskell County, New Mexico Territory. Kemp held the letter for a long moment without speaking. Then he took it. "If I do this," he said, "Pruitt will know it was me." "Yes," Devereaux said. "He will." Kemp folded the envelope carefully and placed it inside his coat. He looked at Clara. "Your father spoke often about the territory eventually righting itself," he said. "He spoke about it the way a man speaks about something he genuinely believes." "He did believe it," Clara said. Kemp turned his mule south and rode. Devereaux watched him go and said nothing. Whether the preacher would follow through was beyond his ability to control. He had copies of everything. He had his own contacts. But Santa Fe was 3 days distant, and Pruitt's men were coming this afternoon. So he turned back to the house and released what he couldn't manage and focused entirely on what he could. They came at 4 in the afternoon, not at night, as he'd anticipated, which told him something about Caulfield's confidence. 6 riders dividing their approach between the south and the west simultaneously, fanning out as they came over the rise. Caulfield was easy to identify. He rode slightly separate from the others, at a measured pace with the bearing of a man who treats violence as a professional procedure rather than a personal matter. Devereaux was inside the barn. Clara was in the root cellar. Neither of them moved as the riders positioned themselves. Caulfield pulled up at the edge of the yard and spent a full minute studying the property. He'd been briefed on one man and one woman, and he was not the kind of professional who accepted briefings at face value. He sat his horse and read the layout and waited. When nothing revealed itself, he called out, "Devereux!" "I know you're here. My employer has a proposition." Devereux walked out of the barn with both hands clearly empty. "I don't need to hear it." $50,000, Caulfield said, "for you and the woman to vacate this county and not return." That's considerable money for a drifter. I'm not a drifter. And he knows I have the federal bribery case already assembled. You think $50,000 makes me forget a railroad commissioner in Colorado and a bookkeeper's sworn testimony from Tucson? Caulfield absorbed this without visible reaction, adjusted, recalibrated, the way a skilled craftsman adjusts when the first approach doesn't produce the result. "Then there's no other conversation to have," he said. "No," Devereux agreed. "There isn't. What happened in the following 3 minutes? Friend, people in Haskell County were still reconstructing it 20 years afterward. When most of the witnesses were old and the details had shifted in the retelling, Caulfield's hand went for his weapon. It did not reach it. Devereux drew and the shot caught Caulfield's gun hand at almost precisely the same point it had caught Rand's the previous morning, a quarter-inch lower. In fact, because Caulfield was marginally faster and the angle differed slightly, and Devereux adjusted for both without conscious thought. The way a craftsman at the edge of his skill operates entirely on instinct, the revolver spun into the dust. Caulfield doubled over his saddle. Two things then occurred that Pruitt's riders had not considered. The wire strung across the dry wash caught the flanking pair at chest height as they attempted to come around the barn's far side. Not hard enough to pull them from their saddles, but enough to stop their horses and tangle them in a chaos of backing and shying that eliminated any clean firing position for 30 seconds. And from the root cellar, a rifle shot placed in the dirt 4 feet in front of the lead rider approaching from the north. Then a voice, calm, unhurried, perfectly audible in the sudden stillness. "The next one goes through your horse's knee. The one after that goes through you." Clara Whitmore had her father's eye and her father's composure, and there was nothing in her voice that sounded remotely like bluffing. The rider on the north side stopped his animal so abruptly it nearly sat down beneath him. No one moved. Caulfield was hunched over his saddle, right hand destroyed. The two in the wash were extricating themselves from the wire. The remaining 3 were very still, running arithmetic in their heads and not approving of the results. Devereux walked toward Caulfield's horse. "Go back to Pruitt," he said. "Tell him I have the ledger. Tell him I have the bookkeeper's statement. Tell him Father Kemp is riding to Santa Fe right now with everything we have assembled. And if he wants to know who I am, he can ask Dale Huck, because Huck knows precisely what happens when men step in front of me." He paused. "Tell him it's finished." Caulfield looked at him through what was clearly considerable pain. "He won't accept that," Caulfield said. "He will," Devereux replied. "When the marshals arrive." They left, 6 horses going south. And then silence, and the rocking W was quiet again. The cottonwoods along the spring stood still in the windless afternoon. Somewhere overhead, a hawk turned wide, unhurried circles, entirely indifferent to the whole business. The marshals rode in on a Friday morning. 3 days after Father Kemp had turned his mule toward the South Road, 2 deputy United States marshals out of Santa Fe, a federal warrant folded in one man's coat, and a rider Devereux recognized from his years under Marshal Poe. A man named Garza, who shook Devereux's hand in the yard and said without preamble, "Good timing on the letter." The federal warrant named Garrett Pruitt and Sheriff Dale Huck as co-conspirators in a scheme involving bribery of a railroad commissioner, coordinated coercion of private landowners through threatened property destruction, and the corruption of a county law enforcement office for private benefit. Thomas Whitmore's ledger was the foundation. The bookkeeper's statement from Tucson was the context. Devereux's own testimony was the map that connected everything. Huck was arrested at his desk in Cutter Creek that afternoon. He didn't resist. He'd probably known it was coming since the morning at the spring. And there was something in his expression when Garza read the warrant. A faint, exhausted easing that suggested some part of him had been waiting for it and was not entirely sorry it had arrived. Pruitt was arrested the following morning at his brick office in Las Cruces. He came out the front door in a pressed suit demanding his attorney and was informed he'd have access to counsel in Santa Fe. He looked smaller than his reputation. That's what Devereux always remembered about him. Later, how small the men who cast the largest shadows always seemed when you finally placed them in ordinary daylight. Huck was stripped of his badge and transported to Albuquerque to await trial. Consolidated Grazing's land claims in Haskell County were frozen pending federal investigation, a process that took 2 years to complete, but ultimately resulted in the return of 3 forcibly acquired properties. To their original owners, Garrett Pruitt served 18 months in federal prison and died without money at 61 in an Albuquerque boarding house.
And this right here is where the story quietly changes from a standoff into accountability. Notice something important. Cal never won because he was faster with a gun. He won because there was evidence. Thomas Whitmore's ledger, the bookkeeper's testimony, and someone finally choosing to stop looking away. That's what brought the whole machine down. Look at Sheriff Huck for a second. He doesn't resist arrest. That detail says more than a dramatic speech ever could. Deep down, he already knew the line had been crossed a long time ago. And Garrett Pruitt, after all the pressure, money, and control, he ends up looking smaller than the fear built around him. Question for you. What actually changed this story? Cal's shot at the spring? Or Clara's father quietly documenting everything for years? Drop your answer below because both mattered, but only one turned power into consequences. And now the fight is over, but the part that stays with people is just beginning.
Which is, as a general matter, where men like Garrett Pruitt tend to end up, friend. The fortune never outlasts the consequences. Father Donald Kemp testified for the prosecution and received clemency in exchange. He resigned his church in Cutter Creek before the trial began, on his own initiative, before anyone asked him to, and no one who'd known him during the Pruitt years offered much in the way of objection. He moved to a small mission outside Taos and spent the decade that followed teaching children to read, which, when you take the full measure of a person's life, is not the worst way to spend the remaining portion of it. Cal Devereux stayed at the Rocking W for 10 days after the marshals came, long enough to confirm the property was secure, long enough to see the new county sheriff, appointed by the territorial government to replace Huck, actually ride into Haskell County and demonstrate some intention of doing his job. He helped Clara repair the south fence where the strung wire had pulled loose from its post. He helped her rehang the barn door. He drank her coffee each morning and they talked, mostly about the land and her plans for it, sometimes about his years with Poe, rarely about what might come next for either of them. On the morning of the 11th day, he saddled the roan mare and brought her around to the yard. Clara came out of the house and stood on the porch steps. "You could stay?" she said. He looked at her. She was holding her father's coffee mug in both hands, and her gray eyes were steady and direct. She wasn't asking him to. She wasn't trying to tip the scale. She was simply stating a fact and leaving the rest to him, which he found he respected more than almost anything she could have done. "You don't need me here," he said. "You know that." She considered disputing it. "Decided it was true. Where are you going?" she asked. He looked west at the long, flat line where the territory became something else, at the pale morning sky just beginning to warm. "There's a man in Tucson who's been avoiding a federal summons for 3 years, he said. "I've been meaning to have a word with him." Clara was quiet. "Then, the thing you've been looking for," she said. "Since Cañon Rojo, I think you may have already found it." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his face, something unplanned, something that arrived without his permission. "Maybe," he said. He swung up into the saddle. The roan turned south without being asked. "Cal," Clara said. He looked back. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the shooting. For staying." He touched the brim of his hat, and then he rode south and west into the white morning, and the sound of his horse on the hard ground faded out, and the cottonwoods along the spring moved once in the first breath of wind, and the Rocking W was quiet, and the spring was cold and clear and exactly where it had always been. Clara Whitmore held that ranch for the next 42 years. When the rail line came through in 1886, the water rights Pruitt had spent years trying to seize by force became the most valuable asset in Haskell County. She managed that leverage with a precision that would have made her father sit a little straighter in his chair. She never sold the spring. She leased it on her terms, at rates she set. To people who understood they were guests at her table, she took every dollar from those arrangements and put it into 2 things her father had talked about for years without ever having the means to attempt: a schoolhouse built in the Rocking W Valley in 1889, and a small infirmary in Cutter Creek, opened in 1891, which remained in operation for 60 years. She ran both, and every August, on the date, a man in a faded poncho had ridden in from the South Trail and said 3 words that changed the direction of everything. She set 2 cups on the porch in the morning. One she drank, the other she left. Now, friend, here we are at the end of it. And I want to tell you what I've carried out of that August morning in Haskell County for all the years since. Because I was there, like I told you, propped against that cottonwood. Watching the whole thing unfold, what stays with me isn't the shooting, and the shooting was as fast as anything I've witnessed before or since. What stays with me is the preacher, not the moment he warned them, not even the ride to Santa Fe, the moment he stood in that yard and spoke plainly about the story he'd been telling himself, because that's the one worth watching for, friend. The story you're telling yourself, the one that makes a slow, quiet surrender feel like standing still. Evil isn't always theatrical. It isn't always a man in a fine suit in a brick office. Sometimes it's a man with a cross around his neck studying the ground because it costs less than looking up. Sometimes it's a badge worn by a man who long ago traded his purpose for a comfortable arrangement and has been calling it something else ever. And the man who changes that, he doesn't always arrive with a legend in front of him. Sometimes he just needs water for his horse, and he sees what he sees, and he says what he says. 3 words. And what comes after those 3 words? That's the story. Every time. Thank you for riding along tonight, friend. If this one meant something to you, give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. And tell me in the comments where you are tonight, what time it is, what you've got in your cup. We read every one of those comments, and they matter more than you'd think.
What makes this ending work isn't revenge, it's what happened afterward. Clara never sold. She protected what everyone said she'd eventually lose. The land stayed hers, the spring stayed hers, and instead of turning power into control, she turned it into opportunity. A school, an infirmary, a future her father never got to see. And Cal, he didn't ride in to become a legend. He stepped in because something was wrong and then kept moving when the work was done. That's probably the strongest idea in this whole story. Real change doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives tired, dusty, and willing to stand where everyone else stayed silent. The preacher learned that excuses have consequences. The sheriff learned authority isn't protection. And Puit learned that fear lasts only until somebody refuses to participate. So now I want to ask you, if you were standing in that yard that morning, would you have spoken up or looked at the ground and stayed quiet? If you found this case and story as powerful as we did, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more courtroom and frontier breakdowns. Until next time, keep your principles closer than your comfort.
Until our trails cross again, keep your powder dry and your conscience clean. This story is a work of fiction, drawn from the spirit and history of the American frontier. All characters, events, and locations are fictional. AI tools were used in the production of this content.